Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving straight into what might be the single greatest philosophical tension underlying modern civic life, the grounding of human rights. The material we're looking at makes it profoundly, well, a rigorous and pretty uncomfortable claim that when many modern secular worldviews invoke inalienable rights, they are engaging in a structural incoherence, essentially building a moral house without any foundation.
And the stakes here are high because we really have to define our terms precisely. When the material uses the word delusion, it's not meant in, a clinical sense. It's a philosophical definition, the fixed, persistent maintenance of a belief while you are simultaneously denying the very conditions that make that belief logically possible.
Exactly.
So if you claim rights are non-negotiable, but you reject the only kind of source that could make them non-negotiable, you're caught. You're in this structural contradiction.
That's it perfectly. So our central question today is a sharp one. Can a coherent belief in genuinely inalienable rights exist within secular frameworks? Atheism, agnosticism, materialist humanism, frameworks that explicitly deny any transcendent source or objective moral order, the kind the Declaration of Independence called the laws of nature and of nature's God. I'm going to argue that without that transcendent grounding, rights they inevitably collapse into mere revocable permissions, which makes the secular claim of inalienable rights a structural delusion.
And I'll be arguing that this material imposes an overly rigid and I think ultimately a false binary. It dismisses the sophisticated, rational attempts made over centuries to ground rights in inherent human reason, in observable dignity, and the universal requirements for flourishing. This path provides a stable and evidence-based third way that is neither mystical nor arbitrary, and therefore, it's not delusional.
My position, it really begins with the language of the American founding. The constitutional foundation demands a source for rights that is beyond human power, so beyond the state, beyond consensus, beyond culture. If the founders had intended merely to express, say, a preference or a political agreement, they would have called them grantable rights or political privileges. They didn't. They called them unalienable for a very specific reason. They recognized them as inherent, pre-existing attributes, much like, the laws of physics are pre-existing. This forces us into what the material accurately calls the inescapable binary. Rights have to flow from either human sources, the state, the collective, democratic consensus, that's option one, or they have to come from an independent, transcendent moral reality. That's option two. There is no logical third category for rights that are somehow binding, but have no source that bind them. And if we choose option one, we have to face the logical consequence. If rights come from human institutions, they're nothing more than permissions. And permissions are subject to revision or revocation by those same institutions. To use a brutal historical example, under this framework, slavery wasn't objectively wrong when states permitted it. It was simply legal, because the state's decision defines justice by definition. So secular worldviews cannot invoke the language of immutability while denying the necessary precondition for that immutability.
Of that binary. However, the material uses that precision, I think, to polemically dismiss these rigorous rational attempts to ground morality in human experience and in observable structure. My core challenge is that option one, this idea that if God doesn't exist, then all rights collapse into might makes right, is just too crude. I'm not convinced that the only alternative to a specific metaphysical creator is total moral nihilism. Let's focus on that third path, the one the material sort of dismisses as defense three, grounding rights in inherent human dignity, reason, and flourishing. These sophisticated frameworks are attempts to establish an objective standard based on observable reality. We can, for instance, define human flourishing as the objective standard, much like we define health as the objective standard for a functioning biological system.
When an act inhibits full rational capacity or destroys dignity, it is objectively detrimental to the structural reality of the human being. So while acknowledging the logical tightness of your binary, I argue that grounding the moral should in this shared, deep-seated human structure and rational consistency, well, that provides an objective measure that's strong enough for civic stability. It's a profound moral impulse to find objective standards through humanism. It's an active intellectual search, not a fixed false belief or a delusion.
I see why you emphasize that search for an internal, a naturalistic grounding. But let's go back to the integrity of the word inalienable, and with the material terms, the civic trap. You say human flourishing is the objective standard. But why must human flourishing be the ultimate authority? The moment you assert that dignity must be respected or that potentiality must be pursued, you've introduced an authority, an ultimate ought that stands above simple preference. Think about this analogy. If I join a private gym club, my right to use the equipment is a permission the club grants me. They can revoke it tomorrow. If the government grants you the right to free speech under option 1, it is a permission granted by the state. They can revoke it tomorrow via amendment or just a change in consensus. But an inalienable right, however, is supposed to be like the law of gravity or the rules of mathematics. No human institution can grant or revoke them because they're structural realities. So if no authority exists beyond human institutions, then the highest human authority, the state, can legitimately alienate your so-called rights. The secular view, therefore, strips the word inalienable of its definitional meaning within the American civic framework. You're relying on a word whose meaning requires the very authority you deny.
Okay, I do acknowledge the severity of that logical challenge, particularly around the word inalienable. But that logical tightness, it doesn't account for the observable fact of human moral progress in the process of challenging injustice. The civic trap, as you framed it, claims that advocating for reform, appealing to a higher justice, requires presupposing a transcendent standard. But I reject the idea that a standard above current rules must automatically be transcendent in that metaphysical sense. An appeal to justice is an appeal to a rationally demonstrable objective standard. For instance, if a rule, like the 3/5 compromise, is objectively incompatible with the recognized rational capacity and dignity of a human being, the appeal is not to a cosmic lawgiver. It's to the internal, observable requirements of rational consistency and structural reality. The standard stands above current rules, yes, but its objectivity is rooted in reason and in empirical reality. The claim that only exists without transcendence simplifies ethical realism far too much. It dismisses the idea that the is of human nature dictates a profound ought. We aren't claiming an external, independent moral law. We are claiming that the very structure of reality, which includes human consciousness, imposes intrinsic moral imperatives.
But this is where the sleight of hand occurs, isn't it? If reality is purely material, comprised only of facts, of is, where does the imperative, the ought, come from? Saying that rational consistency requires it just pushes the question back one step. Why must we adhere to rational consistency? You're smuggling in the transcendent ground we identified in option 2. You're claiming something immutable, non-negotiable, and authoritative about the structure of reality that exists independent of human will or preference. Rationality itself, when you treat it as an ultimate moral guide, just becomes the hidden transcendent authority. If it were just a preference, then an individual could rationally choose to maximize their own power by violating the rights of others. And you would have no objective ground to condemn them beyond, well, that impedes our shared goal.
Our shared goal is predicated on a shared reality. And I think we need to explore the second key point the material raises, which tests the emotional and rational coherence of secular morality. This concept of useful fictions versus genuine moral revulsion. The source material suggests that if rights are just pragmatic constructs, useful fictions, we agree on for social stability, then horrific acts like genocide or the torture of children are merely, strategically suboptimal practices we've agreed to discourage, not genuinely objectively evil. The material then uses the deep feeling of moral outrage that a secular advocate experiences as proof of a contradiction, arguing they secretly believe in the objective wrongness their own philosophy denies.
And I find this to be the strongest piece of evidence for the structural incoherence. The secular advocate who campaigns passionately against injustice, who feels a profound existential moral outrage, they are revealing their true belief system. That feeling of outrage contradicts their stated materialist philosophy. If rights are just fictions, then the torture of a child isn't actually wrong. It's just an act that violates a human agreement. Anyone who feels the wrongness as a deep, binding, non-negotiable fact, a fact as solid as the rock they're standing on, is effectively borrowing the moral ontology they explicitly reject. They depend on objective wrongness, yet they deny the only framework that makes objective wrongness coherent and authoritative. Why should we privilege that subjective, visceral, emotional reaction if it has no objective footing outside of, well, chemistry?
That feeling of outrage is precisely where I want to focus, because the material dismisses it too quickly as a mere internal contradiction. I propose that moral outrage isn't necessarily an echo of a denied metaphysical truth, but an observable, rationally recognized imperative that's built into the structure of human existence. I mean, many sophisticated humanistic models argue that morality, including our capacity for outrage, is an evolved biological mechanism that is then recognized by reason as essential for the survival and optimal structure of a social species. The fact that reason recognizes the necessity of treating others as having equal worth, even if that necessity arose through evolution, gives it objective grounding in our reality. The objective claim isn't that a cosmic decree exists. The objective claim is that injustice is measurably, demonstrably, and rationally incompatible with the reality of human consciousness and social structure. Uncertainty about the metaphysical origin doesn't invalidate the observable binding reality of the moral error. Why must moral certainty necessitate metaphysical certainty about a creator?
Because without the metaphysical certainty, all you have is utility. You're saying that respecting rights is useful for optimal human survival. But if survival is the goal, what happens when it becomes useful for a powerful state to sacrifice the rights of a minority or even torture one person to achieve maximum security or happiness for the majority? Utilitarianism consistently fails the test of inalienability precisely because it lacks an objective, non-negotiable moral command that stands above a calculation of utility. Your evolutionary imperative is just a very slow biological form of consensus, a sophisticated option 1. It's revocable if the species evolves or if the calculation changes. The feeling of revulsion is real, yes, but if it's only a useful evolutionary trick, it doesn't stand up against a state that deems genocide strategically optimal.
But you're forcing the moral experience of the secularist into an overly simplistic utilitarian box. The appeal to human dignity, that's Defense 3, is explicitly anti-utilitarian. It asserts that the individual possesses inherent intrinsic worth that is not derived from their utility to the collective. That worth is observable. We see its violation, and we see the objective damage it inflicts on the human structure. A philosopher can withhold judgment on the origin of that worth, the source code, if you will, while recognizing the objective binding error of an injustice. If reality includes complex structures like reason and consciousness, those structures possess inherent necessities, and violating those necessities is an objective wrong, regardless of whether a creator mandated it.
But uncertainty doesn't resolve the logical necessity of the binary. To claim objective, inherent, intrinsic worth requires an explanation for why that worth is objective and intrinsic, rather than just an assigned value. If you assert that value comes from within the person, you're claiming a non-material, immutable quality, a soul, a spirit, a divine spark, or something equally transcendent, which is exactly the ground you claim to reject. The systematic pattern of explicitly rejecting transcendent ground and simultaneously invoking objectively binding rights creates a contradiction that we have to confront.
And this brings us right to the core issue of defining delusion itself. The materialist argues that this systematic contradiction, this persistent denial of the structural requirement, earns the label delusional.
And I hold fast to that definition. Delusion is the denial of the conditions that make the beliefs possible. The thoughtful, educated individual who insists rights are absolutely binding and non-negotiable, yet at the same moment insists there is no non-negotiable source to bind them, is exhibiting systematic logical failure. They are standing on a moral structure while explicitly rejecting the logical pillars that hold it up. The refusal to accept that logical consequence is, philosophically speaking, driven by the comfort of claiming absolute moral authority without the required metaphysical commitment. That is structural incoherence.
I maintain that framing this as delusion collapses all sophisticated, rigorous humanistic attempts into the crude category of Might makes right. I agree the logical challenge you're posing is severe. It highlights a genuine, profound difficulty for secular ethics. However, difficulty is not delusion. The persistent search for rights grounded in inherent human dignity, that third path, is a reflection of a structural reality that humans perceive through reason. It isn't a fixed false belief because it's based on continuous observation and rational refinement of what constitutes human reality. The failure of the secular framework to provide a comfortable, complete, and metaphysically satisfying ultimate grounding does not equate to a willful, fixed denial of observable reality. It suggests that the definition of reality itself, especially as it relates to human reason, may be deeper and more complex than the material's simple atheist-theist binary allows. The search is for truth, not a self-refuting lie.
The material's logical clarity remains, I think, ruthlessly clear on this point. One cannot coherently invoke the concept of inalienability, of a non-negotiable right that stands above the will of the state, while simultaneously rejecting the only source required to make that claim binding. The structure demands a choice: accept the ground of objective moral reality, or abandon the claims of inalienability that require it, and instead speak only of revocable political permissions.
And I conclude by acknowledging the intellectual necessity of the inescapable binary. It is the critical hurdle for modern moral discourse. However, I believe the necessity of a non-human source for rights may require deeper philosophical exploration of the nature of reason and its relationship to reality itself, perhaps finding the binding force within that relationship rather than immediately dismissing the entire secular project as delusional. The challenge is immense, but the necessity of objective ethics is what drives the search forward.
The material successfully illuminates a core, uncomfortable tension in American civic life, the conflict between our foundational constitutional premise and the dominant modern moral discourse. We'll leave you with the question of whether intellectual coherence or temporary comfort should guide your own understanding of what makes your rights real.